Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my first looks preview of the Fujifilm X-Pro 3, the new joint flagship in the X series, alongside the earlier X-T3. Teased in September 2019 and officially announced a month later, the X-Pro 3 is the successor to the X-Pro 2, launched over 3.5 years previously. As you'd expect, it equips Fujifilm's niche but much loved rangefinder model with the latest 26-megapixel X-Trans4 sensor and X-Processor 4, which are already deployed on the X-T3 and X-T30, but accompanied by a number of design changes that could polarise fans, although, spoiler alert, I was fond of most of them. I had a chance to briefly try out a pre-production X-Pro 3 at an official Fujifilm press event, and in this video I'll show you everything I know so far. As always, once I've reviewed a final production model, I'll link to it here, and you'll also find all of my sample images and movies at cameralabs.com. At first glance, the X-Pro 3 shares a similar design to its predecessors, a solid rectangular block with many stylistic nods to vintage film cameras. Fujifilm's retained the magnesium alloy shell and weatherproofing of the X-Pro 2, but swapped the top and bottom plates for titanium for greater toughness. The dimensions and body weight remain roughly unchanged though. It's now also available in 3 finishes: plain black, Dura Black and Dura Silver, with the Dura versions adding Duratect coatings, typically deployed on luxury watches on the metal surfaces to increase its resistance to scratches. The plain black model, which you'll see in this video, will cost around £1,700, and the Dura coated versions at about £180 more. For reference, the X-T3 body, which shares the same sensor and the joint flagship status, costs £1,349. For US pricing, check my links below. The controls on the upper right surface are essentially unchanged from the X-Pro 2, so you have the dedicated shutter dial with speeds from 1 to 8,000th of a second, plus bulb, time and a lockable A position. Lift up the outer edge of the dial and you can adjust the ISO sensitivity, indicated in a small window, just like old film cameras. To the right is a shutter release button, threaded for old style cable accessories, while in the corner is a non-locking exposure compensation dial. The only change with the X-Pro 2 here is the now unlabelled function button. I'd have personally preferred the exposure compensation dial to be lockable, as I sometimes turn it by mistake when pulling it out of a tight bag, but your mileage may vary. The front controls are also mostly unchanged, although the front finger dial mysteriously has lost its earlier push function. The main action here though revolves around the lever that's reminiscent of the old self-timer controls on some film cameras. Here, like its predecessor, it switches between the viewfinder modes, which I'll show you later in the video. Eagle-eyed Fuji fans will also notice the grip now has a small vertical indentation that actually improves the feel in your hands a lot more than it looks. Round the back, the most obvious change is of course the apparent lack of a main screen, but fear not, for the X-Pro 3 has a couple of tricks up its sleeve I'll show you in just a moment. The other big change is the removal of the 4 joypad style cross keys, which I must admit I was fond of on previous bodies, although you can achieve the same navigation using a joystick. Fujifilm's also changed the function of the buttons to the side, and the thumb dial remains fairly small and push clickable. But forget about all that, I hear you cry, what about the screen? Where's it gone? Okay, so the rear of the X-Pro 3 is now home to a small 1.2-inch non-backlit square display that shows the current film simulation in use, a playful nod to the small windows on older film cameras where you slot in a piece of the cardboard film packaging for reference. It's dynamic too, not just showing the active film simulation but also the current sensitivity and white balance. It remains visible whether the power is on or off, but its actual visibility as a non-backlit display is very dependent on the viewing angle and ambient light, but I really enjoyed it nonetheless. A setting in the menus alternatively lets you switch the display to show basic shooting information at a glance, and this is customizable. Again, a nice touch, although like the submonitor on the GFX 100, I didn't particularly enjoy having to delve into the menus just to switch its function. It's also crying out for some kind of basic menu or settings navigation, most obviously a mini version of the Q menu. Hopefully its function can be expanded with a firmware update in the future if we all ask for it, but before you think this is the X-Pro 3's only screen, prepare yourself for a grand reveal. In its biggest design change, the X-Pro 3's main screen is hidden during normal operation and flipped down to view. It'll angle down by 180 degrees but won't twist around to face you or angle out to the side, and if you mount it on a tripod or positioned on a tabletop, you won't be able to angle down much beyond 90 degrees. Now, this makes it fine for waist level shooting in the 90 degree position though, and this is a key advantage it has over the fixed screens of its predecessors, and it's now touch sensitive too. In terms of navigating the main menus, it's obviously less convenient to flip the screen open for access, but you can alternatively access the menus through the Viewfinder, and once the camera is set up the way you want it, how often would you be adjusting the menus anyway? Fujifilm's reasoning behind the hidden screen was to focus your attention to the Viewfinder experience, which after all is the X-Pro's unique selling point. By hiding the screen, the X-Pro 3 encourages you to shoot at eye level and minimise the distractions of retreating to play back images after every shot. I think it's an appropriate and even desirable solution for the core X-Pro audience, encouraging you to shoot traditionally at eye level without the severity of losing the screen altogether as Leica has experimented with. Plus, you get waist level shooting with the new screen too. Unsurprisingly though, it's the most controversial aspect of the X-Pro 3, so I'd love to hear what you think of it. Remember, this camera is aimed at a specialist audience and there's still the XT models for a more conventional experience. The primary means of composition remains the Viewfinder, which inherits Fujifilm's cunning hybrid capabilities from the X-Pro 2. You're looking at the optical view here, which I actually filmed through the Viewfinder to give you an idea of how it looks. It's now a little larger, less distorted, and with a slightly higher eye point than before, but the main concept remains the same. The white frame indicates the area you'll capture, and like rangefinders allows you to see outside the frame for objects about to enter it. As an overlay, the frame also adjusts size and position to compensate for parallax with closer subjects, or indeed different focal length lenses, and you can also see the active autofocus area. Pushing the Viewfinder lever to the left toggles the hybrid view, which overlays a tiny portion of the electronic panel in the lower right corner for focusing assistance and white balance preview. There's no loss of coverage either, as this corner only showed the lens barrel in the fully optical view. Pushing the lever control to the right toggles the Viewfinder between optical and electronic views, and here's the electronic view, which now employs a higher resolution 3.69 million dot OLED panel that's more detailed than its predecessor, not to mention brighter, with a faster refresh rate and broader colour space too. Like other electronic viewfinders, it'll provide focusing assistance and previews of things like white balance and the film simulation, and of course also lets you play back images or navigate the menus. Indeed, the X-Pro 3 will considerately switch to the electronic view when you press the menu button, even if you were previously composing in the optical mode. So tell me what you think of Fujifilm's approach to composition with the X-Pro 3, from the hybrid viewfinder to the hidden screen. In terms of wired connectivity, there's just two ports: USB-C, that supports 3.1 Gen 1 speeds, and can be used for both charging and power during operation, alongside a 2.5mm jack that's for a remote cord or an external microphone, although if your microphone has a 3.5mm plug on the end, well, you'll need to use an adapter. As far as I understand it, the USB-C port won't support headphones via an adapter like the X-T30 did, although as it's not designed as a movie camera, no one's likely to be bothered. Similarly, there's no HDMI port either, although I'm sure some owners might have wanted to connect it to a display for a slideshow, or is that just me? Behind a door on the right side are a pair of SD card slots, both exploiting UHS 2 speeds. The X-Pro 3 also shoots faster than its predecessors, inheriting the 11 frames per second mechanical shutter and 20 frames per second electronic burst of the X-T3, as well as its 30 frames per second option with a crop. Meanwhile, the battery is housed underneath and should be good for around 370 frames per charge when using the EVF, a boost over the previous models, and again you can now power the camera over USB as well. The X-Pro 3 inherits the X-Trans 4 APS-C sensor of the X-T3, sporting 26 megapixels and embedded phase detector autofocus across the entire frame. Fujifilm claims the autofocus now works at very low light levels down to -6 EV with an f1.4 lens. There's also a neat new feature that allows you to program an autofocus limiter to restrict the range of distances that the lenses will focus over. Some longer lenses already have this built in, but it's handy to apply it to standard or wider ones to reduce the potential for hunting, especially in spontaneous street or event photography or macro photography too. The Ranger program applies to all lenses when this feature is enabled. With the same sensor and image processor as the X-T3 and the X-T30, you'll already know what to expect in terms of image quality, and I have tons of sample images from both models at cameralabs.com, and as soon as I've tested a final production model of the X-Pro 3, I'll add a bunch of sample images to Cameralabs too. As before, the secret behind Fujifilm's lovely out-of-camera JPEGs are the various film simulations, which now include a new classic negative option that will be familiar to anyone who had lab prints made from 35mm film in the 80s. The monochrome adjustment introduced on the X-T3, which let you warm an image towards orange or cool it towards blue, has been enhanced with additional hues, allowing you to give mono images a tint towards red, yellow, magenta or green, with loads of fine variations in between. I really love this feature and hope the XT models receive it with a firmware update. The grain effect has also been enhanced with options to adjust the roughness and grain size, again providing a great control over the final image style and all in camera. Fujifilm's also added a new clarity control, as well as allowing finer white balance adjustments in 10K units. There's also a blue colour chrome effect and the opportunity to output TIFF files in 8 or 16 bits. There's additionally an in-camera HDR mode which combines 3 frames to increase the dynamic range, advanced multiple exposures now combining up to 9 frames, and a very neatly implemented focus bracketing mode which lets you select the closest and furthest distances you'd like to be sharp in the final composite, before then letting the camera work out how many frames it needs to capture based on the focal length, aperture and distance. You will still need to assemble the images in software later though. I use programs like Helicon Focus. Moving on to movies, the X-Pro 3 is not targeted at videographers, but I'm pleased it does at least inherit some of the capabilities of the X-T3. As such, you get to film 1080 in 24 to 60p, or 4K at 24, 25 or 30p, both formats available in 16:9 or the wider 17:9 shapes, and at bit rates up to 200 megabits per second. If you're filming in 4K, the longest clip length is 15 minutes. There's also high-speed cropped 1080 available up to 120p that's conformed in camera for a 4 to 5 times slowdown. And while there's no HDMI output, there is at least the chance to record flat footage internally using F-Log at 420 in 10-bit. It does not have the 4K at 50 or 60p though. Fujifilm's X-Pro 3 upgrades its much-loved Viewfinder series with the expected sensor and processor from the X-T3 and X-T30, but also improves the build quality with titanium top and bottom panels, offers an optional coating for greater scratch resistance, enhances the cunning hybrid viewfinder in both its optical and electronic modes, adds a raft of processing additions including broader monochrome adjustments, and throws in neat focus bracketing and focus limiter options. The biggest physical change though regards the screen, which is now hidden behind a folding panel in order to focus your attention on the eye-level viewfinder experience. During normal use, a small retro-styled non-backlit square screen on the rear shows you the current settings at a glance, but to access the menus or playback images on the larger main screen, you'll need to first fold down a panel to reveal it. This means the X-Pro 3 gains comfortable waist-level shooting over its predecessors, but of course you'll need to make a conscious effort to fold out the screen in order to use it for anything. The hinge at the bottom also means you won't be folding it down by more than 90 degrees when it's mounted on a tripod or just sat on a tabletop. When you first find out about this unusual approach, you can't help but think it's a little restrictive, and it is a little awkward when adjusting the menus. But again, it is to encourage you to use the viewfinder almost exclusively, and you can of course view the menus or playback images through the viewfinder too. The important thing to remember is the X-Pro series is aimed at a specialist market who actually rarely use the main screen and love Fujifilm's hybrid viewfinder experience. I think for its core audience the changes are on the whole beneficial. When shooting with the X-Pro 3 I found I rarely missed the screen and was happy to use the viewfinder for almost everything, including menus. It was also refreshing to not become distracted by the often addictive process of checking every image after you take it, with the camera instead encouraging you to keep your eye at the viewfinder and keep shooting. But the screen's there when you need it, and I appreciated now having the option to comfortably shoot at waist level. I also enjoyed the retro nod of the new small screen on the back, although it could become so much more useful with access to the Q menu and easier switching too. So my firmware requests have already been submitted. So, as before, the X-Pro 3 may have a specialist audience, but I'm pretty sure they'll love what Fujifilm's done here, while more conventional shooters of course have the XT models to choose from. Right, that's it for this first looks video. If you found it useful, you can support me with a like, a follow or a coffee, or by getting yourself a Cameralabs t-shirt or my in-camera book, which actually features loads of Fujifilm images. There's links to everything below, and as always I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. See you next time, bye bye.